Hello, grade 12s. Welcome back from the short break. It's Economics with Ms. Piwe. And just before the ad break, we were looking at the advantages of export promotion, and we looked at a couple of advantages that are brought about by export production. Or promotion rather. And we know that with advantages come disadvantages. So we can't say, well, it's all good, it's all good. There are disadvantages, and now we're going to look at the disadvantages of export promotion. So the first disadvantage that we're going to look at is that the real cost of production is reduced by subsidies and incentives. Okay, so remember we said that cost plays a very important role in all of this, and the fact that government has come in to provide subsidies and incentives in order to reduce the cost of production, because government wants to encourage local suppliers to produce goods that could be exported to other countries. So in order for them to encourage the local suppliers, they've looked at ways to reduce the cost, the real cost, that is, by putting certain subsidies and incentives in place in order to encourage suppliers to produce more goods that could be exported to other countries. So that's the first disadvantage, to say that the real cost of production has been compromised or has been tampered with because of the subsidies and the incentives that are provided by government. Incentives and subsidies reduce prices and force competitors out of the market. So this leads to a lack of competition. So incentives that we discussed earlier on and the subsidies will reduce the prices, and in return they now force the competitors out of the market, and then this leads to a lack of competition. And we know that competition is a healthy aspect of the economy. So if we don't have competition, then we don't have a healthy economy, because we end up with markets that are of a monopoly type. So we actually don't like that, because if people are in a monopoly, they are the sole provider of that particular product or service, and therefore they hike up the prices because they know that we haven't got other alternatives that we could approach for better pricing. So a monopoly is not ideal. That is why we encourage the fact that we need to have more competitors in the market space. So incentives and subsidies do reduce the prices, but they do force other competitors out of the market space. And then this then leads to lack of competition. Another point that we need to look at is the fact that export promotion results in an increased tariffs and quotas by powerful overseas competition or competitors. Okay, so the fact that you now have more export happening, so it will result in increased tariffs, and that's not good. We know that, and quotas by powerful overseas competitors because of their capacity of production. So they now dominate the markets space, and then they can influence the tariffs around that particular product or service that has been offered. And then also export promotion results in the protection of labor. So we've got the protection of labor and intensive industries by developed countries. Okay, so there's a protection of labor, and also there's intensive industries in developed countries, because the developed countries will have the capacity in terms of the resources that are needed in order to make certain products, and therefore there will be more intense activities that are happening in the industries, particularly in the primary sector, where there's a lot of production and where we extract raw materials. So there'll be a lot of activity around that. So the fact that, This results in the protection of labor and intense of industries by developed countries becomes a disadvantage because then what's going to happen to the developing countries that still need to grow themselves, improve themselves, and that do not, they are still dealing with a high number or the high levels of unemployment. So what happens to those countries? So the developed countries are advantaged by the system, whereas the developing countries will not benefit as much as the developed countries are benefiting from this approach. And that increase in tariffs is not a good sign for us as a developing country because now the powerful overseas competitors are now benefiting, and then they are causing this increase in tariffs and in quotas as well. And then they do reduce prices, and then they force other competitors out of the market, which is not a good thing. And also the real cost is affected, or it's been tempered with because of the subsidies that are provided by the government. Okay, so now let's just go back and just compare the advantages and the disadvantages. We know that at the end of the day, it is important for our economy to grow, and it's important for government to create employment opportunities for households because without income, they are able to participate or they are unable to participate in economic activity. So it does bring in, a lot of good things, but at a very higher level or order of thinking or school of thought, there are huge disadvantages as well that are brought about by export promotion. So whereas it does help to grow the economy and to create more economic activity, but it does have its own challenges. But that's with any other system or approach that we may take in terms of the world of economics. So now we've got to look at the advantages and disadvantages and weigh them up and see whether we actually have more advantages than the disadvantages, and then decide whether we're going to export more or we're just going to rely on other countries to provide us with goods and services. All right, so it's important that we show the link and that we don't just, look at advantages and disadvantages in isolation. Just show how they are interrelated, and also, like I said earlier on, weigh them up and see, use the cost-benefit analysis method where the government weighs the cost and the benefits of a project. So if there are more benefits in us promoting exports, and then we should be pro-export. But if there are less benefits and the costs also involved are very high, then we should decide that, let's rather stick with our own local suppliers. Okay, so we move on to our next point where we look at import substitution. So import substitution is part of South Africa's international trade policy. It occurs when locally produced goods replace goods that had previously been imported. This has a positive impact on the balance of trade. Okay, so it is a trade policy in South Africa, and it occurs when locally produced goods replace goods that had previously been imported from other countries. And we know that this has a positive impact on the balance of trade. So there are goods that we previously had been importing into the country that might have brought certain costs with them, and now we as a country are in a position to produce them locally. So we should grab that, and it is encouraged, and we do even have a policy in place that encourages that. And we know that this has a positive impact on the balance of trade. So we call that the import substitution, where products that we previously imported from other countries are now produced locally in our country, and also that has a positive impact on the balance of trade. So what are the reasons for import substitutions? Reasons for import substitutions include the following: diversification. So when goods that were previously imported imported are produced locally, domestic manufacturing expands and an economy becomes less reliant on foreign countries. Okay, so it is a good thing. We're trying to diversify our products and our services, and also we know that the domestic manufacturing market will expand because now these goods are produced locally, and the fact that we are now less reliant on the foreign market or foreign countries is a good thing, because although we may not be fully self-sufficient, but it's important that we are not so fully reliant on other countries for goods and services. And also the industrialization is promoted, the development of new industries to produce previously imported goods can increase the tax revenues and also create jobs. So the fact that now these goods that we used to bring from other countries are now produced locally, so there's more activity happening in our industries, because now it is us South Africans who are now producing these goods. So this could result in an increase in tax revenue. That's good for the government, so they can improve on the infrastructure, and also it creates jobs, so more people are employed as a result of this. So that's a good thing, because it's bringing employment opportunities. People will end up with some form of income, and they can participate in economic activity. So now let's look at the balance of payment problems. Okay, so I'm going to move my screen up. There we are. So now we're looking at the balance of payment problems. If the deficit on the balance of payment is too high, a decrease in imports can help to rectify this. Okay, so now we're looking at the balance of payment, and then if the deficit, remember you have a surplus and a deficit, and when there's a shortage, then we have a deficit. So when the shortage is too high on the balance of payment, if we decrease our imports, this could be used as a corrective measure to rectify this particular situation. So it's also used to rectify the deficit on the balance of payments. And then when we look at trade, developing countries' reliance on natural resources as a basis for growth and development limits their ability to grow. If these resources are used to produce goods and services which can be used domestically or exported, economic growth might be increased. So we know that we rely on our natural resources in order to grow our economy. So sometimes it's not enough because we need to explore other methods or ways of creating more economic activity. So just relying on our natural resources is not good enough. We need to find other alternatives that will assist with economic growth. So we know that when we look at other ways that we could generate or bring in an injection into our economy, that would be obviously by manufacturing more goods locally, and we export them to other countries. So that might help to grow our economy, because now we have more economic growth happening because of the increased production that is currently taking place. So there are more products that are made locally than brought in from other countries. So if we manufacture locally and export, that could lead to an export-led economic growth, which could be a good thing for a country. So the methods of import substitution. So the government imposes certain measures to restrict the amount of imports into the country and to support local industries. Okay, so there will be restrictions. So there will be restrictive policies and regulations that would be put in place or imposed by the government so that they can support the local industries. So the restrictive measures used to reserve the domestic market for the local manufacturers are. So tariffs, when tariffs are imposed, they are designed to discourage locals from buying international brands, but rather than to support the local manufacturers of those particular goods and services. So if there are custom duties or import duties or taxes charged on import duties via the customs and the import duties tariffs, that will discourage local suppliers from buying products from the international markets. So you know that if you buy items, like I said earlier, on overseas and you bring them into the country, you will be subjected to custom duties. If you go through the airport, then you have to go through customs, and then they will then go through those products that you have brought in, and a tariff will be imposed for bringing in items from another country. So that is one of the measures that could be used. And then also a quota system could be used, which limits its limits that are put on the supply of goods and services. Supply is reduced and prices rise. Foreign enterprises benefit if demand for their product remains high. So if there's a quota that is put into place, it would limit the supply of goods and services. So there will be a percentage that would be allowed in terms of what could be supplied. And also it would be good for foreign enterprises if their products remain on the demand or on a high, and therefore that would be good for them. And then because that will encourage, or people will continue to purchase those goods and services. Okay, let's move on. All right, and then we've got subsidies that they enable relatively high-cost domestic enterprises to undercut more efficient foreign enterprises in the domestic market, because now the price will be reduced because government would have granted a subsidy on that particular good or service. Then we've got the exchange control. Government reduces imports by limiting the amount of foreign exchange made available to those who wish to import. Okay, so here we're putting a limitation as well. So we're limiting the amount of foreign exchange that will be made available to those who are wanting to import goods and services. We also have physical control. A complete ban or embargo is imposed on import of certain goods from a particular country. And then the diverting trade, the monetary deposits, time-consuming customs, just move my screen up, procedures and high-quality standards are imposed in order to make the importing of goods more difficult. So there will be these expectations that are made, and then government will use procedures and the high quality standards in order to discourage the importing of goods, or to make it even more difficult for people to import goods. So what are the advantages? So some of the advantages of import substitutions are increased employment. So the more local workers are employed, this stimulates the economy and the GDP increases. That's good. There's more choice for the consumer based on the items that are available on the market. There's diversification of products. They're producing more goods locally, and the range of available goods increases, and the country becomes less vulnerable to foreign actions and conditions. That's a good position to find ourselves in. We have more choice based on diversification. And some of the disadvantages are capital and entrepreneurial talent. This is drawn away from a comparative advantage. Technology borrowed from abroad. This may lead to unsuitable, or this may be unsuitable for local suppliers. And the competitiveness of certain sectors decreases because of the subsidies that have been put into place. And then import substitution leads to a demand for production. So this demand comes from industries that provide inputs to local industries as well. So let's quickly sum up our lesson. So in this lesson, we covered the following concepts. We've looked at protectionism as an important concept where government puts policies and regulations in place through restrictive quotas and tariffs which are designed to benefit local producers of goods and services. And then for free trade, we said that free trade occurs where government creates very few barriers when it comes to international trade. We also looked at the export promotion, which involves providing incentives to to encourage local businesses to produce goods for export. Oh, well, that's a wrap for today's lesson. I've trust that you've enjoyed and you've learned so much from this lesson. From me, it was Piwe. It's a wrap and goodbye.